I'm going to be speaking, even though I'm a physicist, not a biologist, I hope you'll forgive me for speaking about evolution. I'm going to speak about the theory of evolution from a Catholic perspective. Now, when people speak about evolution, they can mean different things. So we must distinguish several layers of evolution. First is the idea of the evolution of species. That is, that the present species of plants and animals arose from other species by a gradual process of evolution, and that ultimately all of them came from a single original form of life. This is sometimes called common descent, since it says that everything descended from a common ancestor. Second, we have the evolution of the human race, the idea that human beings evolved in the same way and thus are part of the same branching tree of life. However, we must be careful here. Do we mean the evolution only of the human body, that is, the evolution of human beings from the physical point of view, or do we mean the evolution of human beings in their entirety, body and soul? As we'll see, that is an all-important question. And third, we have the idea that the principal mechanism of evolution is natural selection acting on random genetic mutations, which is the heart of Darwinism, or neo-Darwinism. Now, one can find many shades of opinion on the subject of evolution, but basically, there are two major battles going on simultaneously that involve evolution and religion. The first battle is, and I should say these are mostly battles that are happening in the United States, not so much in Europe. But the first battle is between so-called creationists and modern science, and has been going on since Darwin's day. Creationists deny that evolution happened at all, or at most, they concede a very limited role to it. Some of them accept that microevolution might have happened, such as the evolution of one kind of cat from another, but they reject the idea of macroevolution, such as the evolution of mammals from reptiles and of all living things ultimately from single-celled organisms. This creationism versus evolution fight has very little intellectual interest in our day. In the view of most scientists, almost all scientists, no matter what their religious stance, whether they're atheists or agnostics or religious, the evidence that evolution of species happened and for common descent is simply overwhelming and growing stronger every day. Anyone who thinks that this scientific consensus is ever going to be overturned is naive. There is simply an irreconcilable difference between the ideas of modern science and any religion that denies that the evolution of species happened. Fortunately, as Catholics, we are not in that position. The second battle has only been going on for about 20 years and is between the so-called intelligent design movement and Darwinism. The intelligent design movement does not dispute, officially at least, that evolution has happened, but says that the Darwinian explanations of it are inadequate. Some clarification is necessary. All Christians believe that God is intelligent and designed the universe, but the intelligent design movement says much more than that. There's claiming that a particular biological theory is inadequate or wrong. So one can believe in God without agreeing with the distinctive claims of the intelligent design movement. Now, one might ask, why have all of these evolution battles heated up so much in recent years? When I was young, in the 1970s and 1960s and 70s, one did not hear so much, or at least I didn't hear so much, about anti-evolutionism in its various forms. What's going on? The recent flare-up is due largely to aggressive atheists on one hand and a certain kind of biblical literalism on the other. Some Protestants, including most, but not all, evangelicals, are committed to this kind of biblical literalism because they think it follows logically from a central principle of Protestantism, sola scriptura, that is, that Scripture is the only authority in matters of faith. And so for them, accepting evolution is impossible. On the other side, we have many people, such as the biologist Richard Dawkins and the philosopher Daniel Dennett, to mention just two out of many, attacking religion, all religion, not just fundamentalist religion, but all religion, using Darwinism as a weapon. They say that evolution has dethroned man by showing that we are merely highly evolved animals, differing in degree but not in kind from other animals. They also say that evolution has demolished the ancient argument from design for the existence of God by showing how things that seem to be designed arose by blind natural forces. Catholics, of course, don't agree with atheists like Dawkins and Dennett on the philosophical implications of evolution, nor do we agree with the fundamentalists on the meaning of the Bible. So what has the Catholic Church had to say about evolution? As far as official teaching goes, that is, pronouncements of the magisterium, the Church said virtually nothing for almost 100 years after Darwin published his theory in 1859. However, some sense of the general attitude of Catholic scholars and theologians towards evolution in the early days of the theory can be gotten from looking at the old Catholic encyclopedia, which was written in the first decade of the 20th century. Of course, this was not an official document of the Church's magisterium, but it was one of the outstanding products of Catholic scholarship at that time, and it carried an imprimatur and nihil obstat, certifying that it contained nothing contrary to Catholic doctrine. The article, and that, by the way, that article can be read online. The whole encyclopedia has been uploaded, so you can read it online for yourself. The article in that encyclopedia, entitled Catholics and Evolution, first summarized the theory of evolution as it stood at that time, and then said, "This is the gist of the theory of evolution as a scientific hypothesis. It is in perfect agreement with the Christian conception of the universe." An impressive book of Catholic apologetics called The Question Box, long out of print, was published around the same time. In a question and answer format, this book responded to hundreds of common objections to the Catholic faith. This book sold several million copies and seems to have been given to students in Catholic high schools in those days. I have my mother's old copy, dating from her high school days in the 1930s. In answer to the question on page 8, "May a Catholic believe in evolution?" the book said, "As the Church has made no pronouncement upon evolution, Catholics are perfectly free to accept evolution either as a scientific hypothesis or as a philosophical speculation." Now, what both of these books were speaking about in the sentences I've just quoted was the evolution of species, that is, of plants and animals. As far as the evolution of human beings was concerned, they were much more cautious. They pointed out that the human soul, being spiritual, cannot be reduced to matter. It goes beyond mere physics, chemistry, and biology, and therefore cannot be explained by any merely material process, such as evolution. Evolution of the human spiritual soul is therefore contrary to Catholic faith. As to whether the human body evolved, these articles came to no conclusion. The encyclopedia admitted that it was, quote, "per se not improbable," unquote, that the human body had evolved, and noted that a version of this idea had, quote, "been propounded by St. Augustine in the 5th century. However, both books thought that scientific evidence for human evolution was weak, and observed that most theologians of that era, most Catholic theologians of that era, had a negative view of the idea that humans evolved. Nevertheless, they admitted that there was no official church teaching on the matter. As far as the mechanism of evolution is concerned, little was said. The idea that evolution of plants and animals was a purely natural process did not seem to be a problem for the church. This is an area where the church's deep philosophical traditions served her very well. Many opponents of evolution see nature and God as being somehow in competition with each other, so that the more we attribute to natural processes or natural causes, the less we can attribute to God, and vice versa. But the church has never accepted this dichotomy. She has always understood that there are two levels of causality, which were called by scholastic theologians primary and secondary causality. These concepts are best explained by a simple analogy. Consider the play Hamlet. In that play, the character Polonius dies because the character Hamlet stabs him through a curtain. So consider the following question. Did Polonius die because the character Hamlet stabbed him? Or did Polonius die because Shakespeare wrote the play that way? Of course, it's an idiotic question. Both the character Hamlet and the playwright Shakespeare are causes of Polonius dying, but they are causes on different levels. Hamlet is the cause within the play, within its plot, the horizontal cause, you might say, whereas Shakespeare is the cause of the play, of the whole play, its entire plot, the vertical cause, you might call that. These two kinds of causality are obviously not in competition. By analogy, the events in the physical world have amongst themselves various horizontal causal relationships. Theologians traditionally call these natural causes within the world secondary causes rather than horizontal causes. And God, as the author of the whole universe and of its whole plot, is the vertical cause, or as theologians said, the primary cause. There's no contradiction or competition between the two. Rather, God's primary causality undergirds all secondary causality. The fact that one physical event can cause another in the natural world is ultimately because God has created a world in which such causal relationships exist. If fire burns wood, it is only because God has created a universe, a world in which there are laws of nature, which are God's laws, and are such that fire burns wood. This basic insight about primary and secondary causality is related to another insight of traditional Catholic teaching, which is that God in his divine nature is outside the flow of time, in the same way that Shakespeare is outside the plot of his play. Shakespeare is not changing as the play moves along. God sees from all eternity the whole pattern of history, from beginning to end, which unfolds according to his plan. The idea of God having to intervene repeatedly to take care of unforeseen problems, or that he is, as it were, making it up as he goes along, is utterly alien to Catholic thought, which sees God as creating everything, all events within the universe, which to us are past, present, and future, by a single all-encompassing act of his will. The question box used an analogy. A billiard player wishes to send 100 balls in different directions. Which will require greater skill? To make 100 strokes and send each ball separately to its goal, or by hitting one ball to send all the 99 others in the directions which he has in view? in the Old Catholic Encyclopedia, put it this way: if God produced the universe by a single creative act of his will, then its natural development by laws implanted in it by its creator is to the greater glory of his divine power and wisdom. The encyclopedia then went on to quote Aquinas and Suarez. St. Thomas says, "The potency of the cause is greater the more remote the effects to which it extends." And Suarez says, "God does not interfere directly with the natural order where secondary causes suffice to produce the intended effect." The Church has always taught that there is a natural order that comes from God, and the greater the powers and potentialities that God has implanted in nature, the more it shows forth his power and greatness. Were these articles atypical of Catholic thinking? I don't think so. For example, John Henry Newman, later Cardinal Newman, and now Blessed John Henry Newman, is considered by many the greatest Catholic theologian of the 19th century. Newman wrote in a letter to the Reverend David Brown in 1874, "I see nothing in the theory of evolution inconsistent with an almighty creator and protector." Even earlier, in 1868, he said, "The theory of Darwin is not necessarily atheistic. It may simply suggest a larger idea of divine prescience and skill." Even earlier, in 1863, he wrote in one of his notebooks, and this is 4 years after The Origin of Species, he wrote in one of his notebooks, "There's as much want of simplicity in the idea of creation of distinct species as in that of the creation of trees in full growth, whose seed is in themselves, or of rocks with fossils in them. I mean, that it is as strange that monkeys should be so like men, with no historical connection between them, as the notion that there should be no course of history by which fossil bones got into rocks." And in the same notebook he wrote, "If secondary causes are conceivable, I do not see why the series of such causes should not last for millions of years as for thousands." The first official pronouncement of the Church on the subject of evolution did not come until 1950, when Pope Pius XII issued his encyclical letter Humani Generis. The Pope specifically addressed the question of the evolution of man, of human beings, and his central point was that one must distinguish the origin of the human body and the origin of the human spiritual soul. The evolution of the spiritual soul, of course, he said, was inconsistent with Catholic faith. On the evolution of the human body, he still took a very cautious stance, even though this was 1950. He said that Catholic scholars could investigate it as a hypothesis as long as they did not jump to any conclusions rashly. Though he was obviously less convinced by the evidence than were most scientists of that time, it's clear that he thought the matter was to be decided by the evidence, empirical evidence, and that he was willing to let the chips fall where they may. The next notable church statement on evolution did not come for nearly a half a century later. In 1996, Pope John Paul II delivered an important address about evolution to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Referring to the encyclical Humani Generis, he said, "Today, half a century after the appearance of that encyclical, some new findings lead us toward the recognition of evolution as more than a hypothesis. In fact, it is remarkable that this theory has had a progressively greater influence on the spirit of researchers following a series of discoveries in different scholarly disciplines. The convergence in the results of these independent studies, which was neither planned nor sought, constitutes in itself a significant argument in favor of the theory," unquote. Of course, the Pope was not officially teaching that evolution is true. The Church does not claim to have the competence, to have competence in deciding scientific questions. The Pope was simply recognizing an obvious fact, namely that there was a great deal of evidence for evolution, and significantly more than there had been in 1950. Pope John Paul II, in the same message, in the same address, reiterated what he called the essential point made by his predecessor, namely that, quote, if the human body takes its origin from pre-existing living matter, nevertheless, the spiritual soul is immediately created by God. I should point out that here immediately means directly, as opposed to through secondary causes. This has always been the essential point for Catholics. For Catholics, it's the spiritual soul that it is the fact that the spiritual soul did not evolve that is crucial. Evolution is a theory of how atoms came to be assembled in certain ways to form biological organisms. However, we human beings are not just assemblages of atoms. We are also spiritual, in that we have rational intellects and free will. Not even many Catholics don't realize when the Catholic Church talks about something being spiritual, it's referring to intellect and will, the power of reason and the power of free will. Those are the aspects of a human being that make us spiritual. And these powers of intellect and will, according to the Church, cannot be explained merely in terms of the motion of atoms. That means that there's not just a difference of degree between us and other animals, but what John Paul II called an ontological discontinuity between us and them. The next important statement was a document issued in 2004 by the International Theological Commission, which is a body that advises the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, at that time headed by Cardinal Ratzinger. The document, called Communion and Stewardship, was approved for publication by Cardinal Ratzinger. It analyzes some of the philosophical and theological issues surrounding evolution. It stresses the same points made by Pius XII and John Paul II, but it contains a lot more. And in particular, it argues that the neo-Darwinian mechanism of evolution is not incompatible with the Catholic doctrine of divine providence. So we can see from all this that the Catholic Church and the best Catholic thinkers have never been caught up in anti-evolutionism.